You're listening to the Common Fan Podcast, a Husker football podcast for the common fan, by the common fan.
Welcome back to the Common Fan Podcast. I am TJ Burkle with Matty Owens Sr. and Geoff in Lincoln. This is episode 3 of The Reckoning. Special guest Brandon Vogel is joining us for all of the Reckoning episodes, and our featured guest today is Sam McKewon. Sam and Brandon, it's an honor to have you with us today.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. In the first episode of this series, we took an in-depth look at whether Nebraska should have fired Frank Solich and what might have happened if they hadn't. In episode 2, we examined the question of whether Bill Callahan would have worked with more time. Make sure to check out those episodes if you haven't already, Common fans, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're at it. The question we're exploring today is Bo-liever or Bo-liever? You might need to sit down for this one, Common fans, so why not sit down in front of a tender, mouth-watering steak or juicy burger from Certified Piedmontese. You can find their premium Nebraska beef products at your local Mercado butcher shop, at 30th and Yankee Hill or 84th and Havelock in Lincoln, and at 162nd and Maple in Omaha. You can also go to cpbeef.com to get Certified Piedmontese products shipped right to your front door anywhere across all 50 states. Certified Piedmontese, powering the Husker football team and powering the Common Fan Podcast. Well, let's get right to it, gentlemen. I feel like we could spend about 6 hours on the Pelini era, but, Brandon and Sam, I promise we'll only keep you for 3 or 4. But after the 2007 season, it's kind of with what we know now, it's interesting to look back. The Huskers had gone 5-7, second losing season out of 4, which was completely unheard of for Nebraska football at the time. But we know the cupboard was not bare. There was talent on the roster. And we'll get into that here shortly. I want to start somewhere else. Sam, I don't remember much of a coaching search. I went back and looked. I guess Tom Osborne interviewed Jim Grobe, who was at Wake Forest at the time and had just won the ACC. He also interviewed Turner Gill, who was at Buffalo at the time. I know Paul Johnson, who was at Navy, Brian Kelly was at Cincinnati, Chris Peterson was at Boise State. Those were some names that were thrown around at the time. I'm not sure if they were ever under serious consideration by Osborne. But my overriding, this is all based on Google searches. My overriding memory is that it was like conventional wisdom that it was going to be Bo. Everyone just kind of knew after they fired Callahan, it's going to be Bo. Do you remember any drama or uncertainty around the coaching search?
I don't remember a lot of drama around it. At that time, I was working for a small website. I wasn't at the World Herald. It's called Nebraska State Paper. And, so I wasn't probably maybe as dialed in as I became later, when I got more sources and worked for different outlets. But what I will say is that I recall, Osborne being named the AD, and a sense that it's probably Bill Callahan's days are numbered. And Bo Pelini was the defensive coordinator at LSU. And LSU was in the midst of this great season. And Bo was certainly charismatic and being listed for some of these other jobs. And so he was certainly, right in the mix. And everybody just was drawn to him. I think a lot of Nebraska fans liked him because he was fiery. And Frank wasn't that fiery. And Bill Callahan was almost not at all. Like, he was very reserved and with inward, and I think that bothered people. Although those few moments that Bill Callahan really lost his temper, he did it in weird ways, with the throat slash and some of the other things he did. So, Bo was sort of out there, and I think there was a sense that, people wanted him to be the coach. I think he had a lot of popularity. I think Turner Gill probably got serious consideration for that job, maybe out of loyalty from Tom Osborne. But yeah, I think so. And I do think they talked to Grobe and maybe a few others. So they put their irons in the fire a little bit. Honestly, I think they put their irons in the fire more than they did, more than Sean Eichorst did with Mike Riley. I mean, I think Eichorst went through such a quick process, and it was probably Paul Chris, and then it was Mike Riley, but this was a whole different thing. So I think they put in a little bit of due diligence, but yeah, Bo is probably always going to be the guy.
Brandon, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, pretty similar. I was not even living in the state of Nebraska at that point, so was just really following it from afar, and it my memory is it felt pretty foregone that Bo was a guy that people were familiar with, not just in terms of temperament, but also defense versus the West Coast offense piece of it. It kind of this isn't always a good thing, but it checked the opposite of your X boxes pretty significantly. And then with what LSU was doing that season, really just I think kind of cemented it and pushed that thing over the top. So,
well, Bo was so in 2003 when he was the defensive coordinator under Solich. Bo was so popular. I mean, dare I say, beloved by Nebraska fans. And in the year before he got there as defensive coordinator, Nebraska was 45th in total defense in 2002. He got him all the way to ranked third in total defense in 2003. Forced a school record 44 turnovers. I remember people being pretty positive about Bo being hired. I know I was thrilled as a common fan. Sam, what was your recollection? Do you think fans were generally happy with the hire? And what about the media? What did the media think? Did they think it was a good hire?
Oh, the media around here has always been, always comes around, so to speak, on just about every hire, to be honest with you. The one that probably got the most skepticism was Riley. But yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there was a sense of what Bo had accomplished in 2003. What I'll say is that one of the boxes that it checked is it sort of restored what I wrote at the time was the House of Osborne, where Tom Osborne had taken the job, the AD job. I feel like he obviously couldn't rehire Frank. That wasn't going to be the solution. But what he did is he hired the guy. He hired the best decision Frank made, which was to hire Bo. And there was a kind of restoration there. Like, I can't remember if it was a program in the first 08 game, or I think it was maybe on Husker Vision, and they showed they showed Bob and Tom and Frank, and then Bo. Bill Callahan didn't exist. I can't remember if that's exactly the way it went. I don't want to, I don't want to be speaking out of school here, but I remember there being this kind of Bill was sort of omitted from the picture, so to speak, and so there was this sense of restoration with Bo getting hired, that it was righting a wrong in a sense. And I remember at Bo's press conference, he mentioned Solich too. So I think there was a kind of circular process to that. That Nebraska's original sin was firing Frank Solich, and so there always has to be a kind of deference given to that. And so I think that's part of the reason. And I think fans were generally positive about it. There were question marks for sure. His ability to lead in terms of and not lose his stuff. That was probably the biggest question. And as we learned, that would be maybe his biggest issue. But no, I think people are mostly on board.
Right. And I don't remember a lot of people saying much about it being his first time as a head coach at the major college level. But that would have been a valid argument to make. Brandon, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think if there were slight issues to be had, like what I recall is hearing the first time head coach thing come up, but I also think it was just it was 15, 16 years ago now, but it was, I think it was different then. That wasn't as big. I don't remember that being as big a hurdle as I think it would be now. And I think that's probably fair given all of the things a head coach has to do today with the schedule and NIL and all of that stuff. You could, sure, maybe the Solich hire, well, he got fired. But and we examined that in an earlier episode. You look at the record, better than Callahan. He moved up from coordinator. Osborne was a coordinator, moved up. So I think if I had to pinpoint something, I do remember hearing a couple of times, as a first time head coach, is he gonna be ready for this? And to Sam's point, that would become a larger issue later on. And, kind of trace the error, then it's easier in hindsight. But for the most part, I think it was, this was kind of the candidate. Everybody could have, the day you fire Callahan, you could say, oh, Bo Pelini seems like he should be on the list. And he was on the list and he was the guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sam, I want to circle back. You said something that kind of got my ears perked up. Just the contrast between Callahan and Pelini.
Yeah.
But back in like 2003, when he was the defensive coordinator, Husker fans loved his fire and his passion. It was awesome. And then when he was hired to replace Callahan, they liked that contrast, like you were saying, the fiery Pelini versus almost like the robotic type Callahan demeanor. So I just want to know, in your opinion, were there any early indications that that thing that all of our Husker fans love, that fiery passion about him, would also be the thing that got him into trouble at times in Nebraska? Were there any early indicators of that I'm not remembering back in the day?
Oh, he'd always ratchet up the intensity early in training camps on his team. A lot of times he was often in a bad mood, and we'd joke about it. Now, for what it's worth, Nebraska's access, media access back then was unbelievable, and was honestly too much. Like, I think during training camp this year with Rule, we'll probably talk to him two days a week, and it's decent access. Back then, it was 4 or 5 days a week, and it was like all the assistants and anybody you wanted, and a lot of the players, and sometimes the players would talk twice, and so like the access had always been sort of set as a standard under Osborne. And when I was in college, I mean, we'd be there 3 or 4 days a week. And if you wanted to talk to TO, we'd be running out around the field afterward, and you'd wait. And so anyway, the access was incredible. And I think that kind of wore on Bo right away. But I remember him getting, and State Papers, I think, defunct, so I can't pull up the stories anymore. But he was pissed off, like, I don't know, third day of camp. I don't know what happened. And then he was really upset the first day of school. They didn't do this or that or something. And so he would turn the dial up, and I'll be honest with you, hindsight being 2020, I think sometimes he was artificially doing it. I don't like, sometimes it seemed like he lost control, and sometimes it felt like he was in control, and it was just sort of dysfunctional. The way that he would sort of he'd play that tune a little bit. He'd play the anger card. Early signs in his career. Oh yeah. I mean, he got a personal foul in the Virginia Tech game that, kind of sealed the game. I think they were going to lose the game anyway. But yeah, I mean, he called the ref a terrible name, and that was in, I don't know, whatever game that was, third, fourth game of his tenure, fourth game, I think. Game that, as it turns out, Virginia Tech was pretty darn good. I think they won the Orange Bowl, or they were very good. But a game Nebraska probably could have won, and didn't. Sue picked up a penalty late, I think, and Bo got pissed about that. So yeah, I mean, it was evident pretty quickly that his temper was, fierce, and that was just a jumpy staff in general. Now, interestingly enough, Carl was actually sort of he had a temper too, but he directed it. And so he was kind of like the cold fire, and Bo was the hot fire. And then you had Mike Eckler, who was just jumping around all over the place. And like, that annoyed me. And there are people who swear by that guy and love him and all the rest, but like, that annoyed me. Like, I'm like, dude, just dial it down. And he's the guy that went to the Big Red Breakfast and said they had this plan for Missouri that, Chase Daniel wasn't going to be ready for. And that was a stupid thing to say. And that blew up in his face. And so they had some high octane personalities within that coaching staff. Sean Watson was pretty cool under fire. He'd get upset later, but just the way that some of the guys sort of reacted to each other, you could tell, gosh dang, this thing's going to be kind of a powder cake a little bit. Yeah. And you can just tell that by the sideline demeanor and the whole thing. And they were so lucky, A, to have the Callahan talent that Bill had recruited, but B, to have Joe Ganser. And they were so fortunate to have him, because he got them through some things, and he had Todd Peterson and Nate Swift, and that helped. But he got them through some things that I don't know that they would have gotten through in year one if it had just been, if Bo had to roll Patrick Witt out there, it would have been rough. So Matt Rule last year, he didn't have the benefit of an Adrian Martinez, he chose not to bring Casey Thompson back, and I do think that's kind of what happened. And Casey, I just don't think it was going to work. But Casey probably would have helped them last year in hindsight, and Joe really helped that first Bo team. That's why they were as good as they were, is because of Joe.
Brandon, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, nothing much more to add to that other than, for me, the chip on the shoulder nature of this staff was evident, I think, very early on. And also, sort of Sam's point, the volatility was as well. And by the time we get towards 2013, 2014, I think those kind of are there as the potentially unfixable flaws with this group. At least Sean Eichorst must have thought they were unfixable.
Yeah. Okay. So into the Pelini tenure, he never wins fewer than 9 games, as all common fans know at this point. It was 9-4 in 2008 with the win in the Gator Bowl, 10-4 in 2009 with the famous 1-second loss to Texas in the Big 12 championship game, 10-4 in 2010 with a loss to Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship game. They go 9-4 in 2011 with a loss in the Capital One Bowl. 10-4 in 2012 with a loss to Wisconsin in the Big 10 championship game. 9-4 in 2013 where they won the Gator Bowl. 9-3 in 2014. Of course, he was fired after the Iowa game in Iowa City. Huskers won that in overtime, and then they went on to lose the Holiday Bowl to USC. I think it was 45-42, if I remember correctly. Starting with those first 3 years of the Pelini era. Sam, you hinted at it. T.O.'s back. Pelini, one of us, is hired as the head man. It felt like things were right with the universe. And then very quickly, that year one was a transition year, as you mentioned. But very quickly, they're in the conference title game. Division titles in 2009 and 2010. Those are both disappointing losses. Even the Oklahoma one, they blew a 17-point lead and shut out in the second half. But the trajectory was back in the right direction. It was like, okay, here we're in Nebraska again. We're playing defense again. We're good again. We're going to win the conference eventually. This is all moving. The Callahan experiment was a blip on the radar. I'm curious about your guys' recollection of those first 3 years. Did it feel like he was on his way? He was going to eventually figure it out and win those okay, well, we lost a couple conference championship games, but we're well on the way. Or did those losses reveal something that maybe there were some concerns or bigger problems under the surface?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of fun moments in those first 3 years. The 2010 year is the regret, right? If they can get that season right, if they hadn't been as dysfunctional as they were, and that team was dysfunctional, not quite 1999 dysfunctional, but up there. And but in 2009, there were some really memorable moments from that year. Obviously, the Missouri game in the rain. Sean Watson standing there after the game, and he's like, "This is the moment we've been waiting for." He was just off. That was really Ndamukong Suh's coming out party, and of course, that was 3.5 years into his career, 4.5 years. And I remember that night. He rolled up over Blaine Gabbert's ankle, and and there was a little tent at Missouri, and all the fans are pouring shit down to whatever. And Suh comes out, everybody just gets really quiet because it's like, this is the best football player that any of us have seen in a while. And I know he didn't win the Heisman, but that's meaningless. He was the best player. And so everybody kind of got quiet, and he kind of sat down, and, he said what he said that night. And then I remember Baylor that year. So that was a terrible football game. Zach Lee had gotten hurt, and Cody Green had to play, and he didn't play well. He threw a pick 6. I think Nebraska won 20-10, and Nick Florence was the backup. Robert RG3 had injured his knee. He was out. And after the game, Bo's at a little desk, like a little school teacher desk, because Baylor that stadium sucked. Floyd Casey Stadium was bad. The only thing they had was Dr. Pepper in the press box. But so it was like there's these 2 cages and this desk, and we're all here, and there's fans on either side, and they're Husker fans, and they're looking in and both talking. And at some point, about 2 minutes in, somebody in the back in the crowd's like, "You suck, Watson!" really loud. And it was Sean Watson that they were yelling it at. And Bo finished his presser, and then he went right over to the cage, and he's looking. And it was, there was just, and I mean this in the best way, there was a kind of drama and energy around the program that bugged you, but it was also like, man, this thing has just got an electricity to it. And Bo's kind of a live wire, and they got some players on the team. I mean, Sue's good and Crick's good, and now's Paul's still on the team. And so like there's just an energy around it that was unique and interesting. And so it was kind of fun going to the games. You never quite knew what was going to happen. You didn't know what he was going to say. The assistants would occasionally get combative. You never quite knew what Carl was going to do or say. So there was electricity about it. And then in 2010, yeah, I think most people who cover the program, and there's people who can talk about this probably more intelligently than I, the training camp going into 2010. And I wasn't there for the Big 12 championship in 09. Dirk wrote that great story about it. You can always ask him about it. But 09, obviously, there were fissures and problems and all those things. And the way that game ended, we don't need to rehash. I don't need to rehash it. If you guys want to, you can. But the training camp of 2010, they're a preseason top 7 team, something like that. Everybody thinks they're going to compete for the national championship. They got all the dudes. And Bo was just, yeah, he was wound way too tight. They hadn't figured out who their quarterback was going to be. Remember, it was a 3-man race. KETV had Zach, Cody, or Taylor. They had that, sweet life of whatever. And everybody was keyed up. And he was over his, he was really worked up. And you could tell that he was really wound up. He knew he had a great team. And that's when it was kind of like, I am going to drop this Fabergé egg. I just know I am. And I'm going to do something that's going to like submarine this team. That's when you knew that like he was going to have a hard time bringing the program all the way to the highest point, because he really struggled when they were playing with house money. House money was the thing that Bo couldn't play with. He had to have his back against the wall. And when that training camp hit in 2010, I sensed that.
So when you say things were dysfunctional, did it all stem from that and just sort of like a sort of unpredictable and explosive, just Bo being wound so tight?
He had a weird sense of humor. I mean, this is a guy that used to stage fights with his players as pranks against his team.
Yeah, I remember that.
That's a different kind of guy. This is a guy that, Mike Nobler was his video coordinator, and he pranked Mike by putting like, I don't know, fake drugs in his car. And like, Bo's just a different kind of guy. So he was different, and Carl was different, and Carl's really smart on top of being different. And I think sometimes Bo and Carl kind of played off each other. Carl was saying stuff, and I don't know, like there's certain things that became obvious about Bo starting in 2011 moving forward. But in those early years, that was just my sense of it. I wasn't around the program until that 2010 season. I was working for that Rinky Dink website. So in 08 and 09, I was, probably I was at every home game, but I wasn't at every game. And then, 2010 and then beyond, it became more clear to me. But yeah, there was a lot around Taylor Martinez.
Yeah, right.
Different guy. He's changed. Last time he was here, he was way different last year. And a lot of heat there. His dad was, cared very much for his son and was an advocate. And, Taylor exploded onto the scene and all that. And of course, Cody wanted to play. And there were guys on that offense that probably didn't want Taylor to be the guy. And they wanted Zach because he could throw, and just all kinds of stuff. And Bo basically decided Taylor was going to be the starting quarterback. Bo had a habit of saying, hey, I could basically coach any position. And so, he kind of took that over, and Taylor's the quarterback. So there was drama there, but there was other stuff too. Remember, they were leaving for the Big Ten, and that happened in June of 2010. And then everybody was on edge in 2010. So everything, there was so much on the line in that last year that I think, Bo just didn't quite bring it over the goal line. He struggled, I think, to deal with the pressure and the spotlight. And then, I don't think he was a fan of the chancellor at the time either.
Yeah. Brandon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sam's point about house money is an important one. It was always kind of my impression of this era that was the case. Mentioning some of the pranks, Bo kind of had the vibe of like an 80s teen comedy heavy. He was the jock, like he was a fighter, like he wanted to fight. And I mean, and you would see this more so once we get to the Big Ten era. Like, Nebraska was often better on the road than it was. That would become the case. But over those first 3 years, I think you could argue that the trajectory was, straight trending upward up until October of 2010. Because, even in 09, after everybody gets over how they lost to Texas, it was like, well, Texas got to come to Lincoln next year. And we'll see what happens. Nebraska was a top 5 team. I think Texas was unranked. And you lose that one. You still can't get over the Texas hump. And then you
read out the world, read out
yeah.
around the world.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Right. And then you have the A&M debacle, which I think really then shows some of the dysfunction Sam's talking about a little bit there. And so you get to the end of that and the pressure of, well, yeah, let's leave the Big 12 by winning the whole darn thing. It's a tough year. And through all that, I still think that was probably the best team of the league there. I mean, if you wanted to argue for 09, yeah, but this was a more complete team on both sides.
Yeah, the read out around the world, it was some sort of promotion. But everybody thought it was very much about Texas, and I don't think they intended it that way, but it was a very ominous promotion where they're like, there's a storm coming. And it was done in the summer, and Texas comes into town, and Will Muschamp was their defensive coordinator, pretty good defensive coordinator. And the reality is, I think what Texas figured out is that Taylor was basically pre-reading what he was going to do. He wasn't running the zone read by reading it. And so they were able to kind of capture that and take him out. I'm not sure I ever saw Rex Burkhead drop a ball except for that one game, and Rex was a Tim Beck recruit. They recruited pretty well early in their tenure. Carl Pelini could recruit, incidentally, and he could really recruit junior colleges. He's the one that had the relationship with Jeff Sims that got Levante David. He had all the relationships with the California JUCOs. Carl was good at that. And so they had some players. They had DeJon Gomes and all that stuff, but I don't know if I ever saw Rex drop a ball except that one. That would have been a touchdown. And he face planted right into the pylon. And none of us could believe it. And that was like, okay, it's Texas. This is what happens when they play Texas. And they lost that game. And then then they went on the road and they played Oklahoma State. And they won a shootout. Yeah. Then they came back, and I think they played Missouri. And Bo actually took them on a drive out of town. And then back into town as if they were going to a road game because of how well they had played against Washington, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State. It's so like they were pretty far inside their own head at that point. There's just a lot of stuff about on message boards and online people and Bo being worked up about that. It was just, again, there was just a lot going on. And I'm not sure Bo ever thought he had any real allies, but he didn't think he had many. And so he just kind of do things on his own.
Fascinating. You talked about Carl recruiting. One thing that I've noticed during these years of constant coaching overturn and changes is fans trying to grasp at straws about, well, why did this work? There's got to be a reason this doesn't work. And the number one reason I always notice people say is, well, if you go and look back at it, this coach actually was playing with somebody else's recruits. It wasn't even his guys. Right. He had a lot of talent given to him. Yeah. And with this situation, though, I even thought it was 100% true. He did have a lot of talent. He's a good coach by all accounts. I want to give him credit in that regard. But when it comes to the recruits that were left to him when he got here, how much did that help him to the common fan? Because I think a lot of common fans forget the talent that he got coming in as a head coach here.
It helped him. Yep. Initially, they had some really good defensive players. Prince Amukamara was here, and Dominican Sue was here. Jared Crick would have been here either way, but Jared Crick was here. So, Bill Bush deserves credit for Prince, and, Sue came, Sue was here as well. And the late John Blake deserves credit for that. So, I think they had some players. But again, Bo and Carl and that group did recruit some football players in the first couple classes. I mean, Rex Burkhead and Taylor Martinez are good players. Maybe the guy that I feel like gets most unfairly maligned is Taylor. Of all the players that Nebraska had over the last 15 years or so. Now, of course, he was awkward as heck with the media, and he's, I'm sure he regrets some of that. But Taylor was a good quarterback, and he was tough. He was really tough. The two injuries that he suffered in 2010 and 2013 were serious, real deal injuries, and the one in 2013 was awful. It was basically like a big nail being stuck through your foot. I've seen the pictures of that surgery, and so Taylor was playing through pain that most people couldn't play through. And so he was a good recruit, and he was the second quarterback. As people might recall, Cody Green was the first one, and Taylor was the second one. And, I think they had some good players. I mean, Jason Ankra was good. Eric Martin was a good player. He was in the 09 class. Their lines weren't great. Their offensive lines weren't great. And he had a pretty good one when he got there. He had Leiden Murtha and Matt Slauson, and so they could run the football a little bit in 08, and they were pretty good in 2009 and 2010 too, with Keith Williams, who's now back at the school. Their lines probably didn't get a lot better, but he could recruit a little. He benefited from Callahan's talent for sure. But yeah, like Bo in hindsight looks better than Bo at the time, because you have to remember the context that Nebraska was in at that moment. Frank Solich had won a lot of games, and they fired him. And I don't think they should. Just for the record, I don't think they should have fired Frank. Now that said, had Frank gone a couple more years and he had gone 6-6 and 7-5, they might have fired him. And I don't think anybody would have blinked an eye at that if that had happened. They fired him too fast. And then, Bill Callahan was viewed as like a traitor and all these other things. And he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't that at all, but he was hired by Steve Peterson. And so the presumption was Bo was just going to take the program right back to where it was, not in 2003, but basically back to like 99. And so there was a lot of expectation that he was going to do that. And when it became clear that he could coach very good teams, but not great ones. And I don't think he had a 12-win team coming the way that he operated. I mean, his team just could not handle big game situations. People got pretty ticked because they're like, well, this guy was not hired to win 9. He was hired to do X, Y, and Z. Well, if Matt Rule won 9 games in a row for 7 seasons, they might put a statue out there now. So, now Bo had some advantages, but at the same time, people were tough on him at the time. And they were tough on some of his assistants. I mean, Taylor Martinez was probably the most unfairly maligned player, and Barney Cotton was the most unfairly maligned offensive line coach. He's still the best offensive line coach they've had in a long time. Like, Barney had something to do with the way they ran the ball too. Barney was a good guy and a good mind, and we were tough on him. I remember one time, and Barney could kick my ass 6 ways to Sunday. And I remember this group of reporters backing him up into the water fountain inside the Hawks one day, asking him about why Tyler Moore was transferring. And I mean, we had this guy cornered on, some guy transferring, and then people transfer all the time now. And that was in 2011, I think. I can't remember what year that was, but us doing that to him is Bo got so pissed off about that. That's what spawned the Biff the Blogger moment. I don't know if you guys have ever read about that, but it was a subsequent practice. Bo pulled us all together and he was like, turn off all the cameras, do this. We did. It was off the record, and he was talking tough and saying some stuff, and a couple reporters didn't like it. And then he's like, all right, well, you know what? No access for the rest of practice. He just kind of pulled that. Me and Dirk went out into the lobby and pulled him like, what are you doing? Like, no. There were times, and people don't know this, reporters tried to work with him because we're like, you don't want to do this. We don't want you to do it, and you don't want to do it. And so, like, that was one of those moments where we pulled him out, and then all the reporters came out there, and he's like going after everybody and saying all this stuff. And that's when he said the thing about Biff the Blogger. He's like, I don't want Biff the Blogger, to whatever. And so we shouldn't be reporting what Biff the Blogger's saying. So Bo was hyper aware. And when you're hyper aware, you're just, I don't know. It's like anything can bother you. And I think that's part of what began to happen. Is that he just got bothered by every little thing. And that trickled down to his coaches, and Sean Watson got bothered by every little thing. Sure. And other coaches did too. It became infectious.
Brett, you
Sam,
got anything you need to add there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I would agree. Obviously, the talent, the timing of the Pelini era and the move to the Big Ten makes things interesting because I think what you're seeing there. So there's a difference. I think there's a big difference in results. So, and obviously that the losses in particular, Big 12 era, I think 12 losses by about an average 10 points. You move to the Big 10 era, that becomes 17, and it becomes a lot of the scare scores that a lot of people can still recite from memory. And I do think a big part of that is the move to the Big Ten. If the Big 12 was a fun and loose sporting event, winning the Big Ten can be more like a standardized test a lot of times. And I think particularly against some of the teams Nebraska faced often, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the like. Remember Bo Pelini, volatile fighter, 80s movie heavy. And standardized test isn't the first thing you think of in terms of things that will match their skill set. So I think we see that unfold as we move towards that section of the Pelini era. But it also coincides with I think the talent was slightly diminished from what they had inherited.
Yeah, I think that's right. When they moved to the Big Ten, Bo had kind of cracked the code on the Big 12, and he probably would have had to change over time, but they ran kind of a two high safety defense with, I don't know what you want to call it, a match zone underneath where you're sort of your linebackers and your underneath safeties or whatever you want to call them, or your nickel or peso, I think as they called it. We're sort of following the receivers and then they're passing them off through a zone, but it's a man defense. And it wasn't the biggest defense, like physically, like they weren't huge. And then they go to the Big Ten, the first game they play against Wisconsin. And people can go watch this on YouTube. They just go Monty Ball downhill, pulling linemen, walling off Sean Fisher. And it's like, yeah, this isn't gonna. These linemen are big and they're fast and they're strong. And the reality is, Nebraska's linebackers, just even Levante, who is an incredible player, he can't. I mean, if you block him, you block him. And so Nebraska struggled right off the jump against teams that could really run the ball, including Wisconsin. And that just, I don't know, Bo never quite changed it. Like he was pretty stubborn with the too high thing, and all the way to 2014 Wisconsin. I'd always heard they had a defense in for like a one high safety that week to change some things around. And they come out in the game, the two safeties are back, and of course Melvin Gordon struggled early, but he ended up running wild. So but I think Bo struggled to adjust to that style of offense in that league. I just don't think he ever quite figured it out. And then the next week they played Minnesota, and Minnesota just gained like 3 yards every time, and that Nebraska couldn't get him off the field. And so it was just evident that his defense had not adjusted.
Wow. Well, circling back I want to go back to a little bit about Bo's personality. I kind of think of it as, at some point in our lives, I think we all have that buddy that there are moments where we're kind of like, God, why am I friends with this guy? And that's kind of how I view the Bo Pelini era. Like we're winning we're winning some beating some good teams, beating some ranked teams. But then, we have the antics and the freak outs on the sideline, putting the finger in his quarterback's chest on national TV, flinging his hat at a referee against Iowa. We all know about those things. I'm fascinated, Sam, about some of these accounts that I haven't heard of, obviously, that you've kind of already mentioned on this episode. But you see and hear things like on a message board about him, confronting a fan or a donor at a hotel or a bar the night before a game, and not to get into rumor mongering anything like that, but are there some other things that maybe were unrelated to the actual X's and O's and coaching of the team, and more of a distraction to the team off the field?
Yeah, the thing that you bring up about the hotel, I feel like we eventually wrote about it, but I can't remember where and in what context. I feel like we eventually wrote about that or briefly wrote about it, but maybe we didn't. Yeah, like I know some of the details of that, but yeah, I think Bo just was affected by things. Like he He was easily bothered by things that he couldn't control that weren't particularly germane to the situation. He at times would like Steve Jobs has a reality distortion field. Bo thought he did, but he didn't. And so it would piss him off when things didn't go the way he kind of really thought Bubba Starling was going to stay, and Bubba Starling wasn't going to stay. So like there were moments like that where he would get frustrated. One thing I'll also say about Bo is that he could be your buddy. So, there were moments where he'd help you out. Or he'd say, what do you, he'd call you. And he didn't call me that much, but he called some of my colleagues and others more. What are you doing, brother? What do you need from me? I'm like, I didn't even ask for anything. He could be that way. One time I had asked for us to get access to practice. I'm like, we just need to be able to see something, because we haven't seen anything in a while in spring camp. And I was going up to put my recorder up there, and he's like, I'm going to give you what you want. He kind of said it real low. Other people could hear it, and they opened up a practice, and that was supposed to be seen as a real, whatever you call it, olive branch. And that was like 2013. I'm going to say 2012, 2013. And so, there were moments where he could be really warm to you, and it was kind of odd because you're like, yeah, you were just yelling at me like yesterday. So, and he didn't yell at me too much. I don't want to exaggerate his behavior toward me. The reality is it was pretty good. There were a couple other coaches who probably were a little icier to me. I mean, Mike Eckler was icy to me because I asked him a question about them losing to Texas Tech, and he didn't think I should ask him a question about losing to Texas Tech. Something like, okay, that's fine. There were other people though that were, that had very contentious relationships with Bo, kind of back and forth, hot, cold. I think he had that kind of relationship with some of his own coaches. So, yeah, I mean, I think there were things you'd hear stuff now and again. Some of it was probably apocryphal, but he just had a certain way. I mean, you never missed him. Like he was very recognizable, and so he wasn't the kind of guy that could kind of like duck into a back room. Bill Callahan could. I mean, you put a hat on Bill Callahan, I'm not sure anybody really have known who he was. But Bo, he's just really recognizable. So interesting guy.
Well, as has been mentioned, so Nebraska moves to the Big Ten in 2011. That sort of conference transition year was sort of a good microcosm of the Bo era. They had some notable wins, the comeback against Ohio State in the rain, manhandling number 9 Michigan State in Lincoln, where they beat them 24-3. And they win at number 12 Penn State 17-14. As Sam mentioned, they were also blown out by a Russell Wilson-led Wisconsin team. They were also drubbed by a Denard Robinson-led Michigan team. And then they had that sort of unexpected loss to Northwestern at home, 28-25 loss to Northwestern. Yeah. But then they win the division again in 2012. And maybe looking back, not as remarkable as it felt at the time because Ohio State was briefly down and sort of, some others in the conference weren't what they are now, frankly. But it was interesting after they beat Wisconsin at home by 3, they get blown out by Ohio State. And then Pelini makes a comment that they have to win out. And I think everybody was kind of like, okay, Bo. And the Huskers do just that. They win 6 in a row, including like some tough, gritty wins. I mean, you got 29-28 at Northwestern, 28-24 at Michigan State. That last game of the season, freezing day in Iowa City. They go down 7-0. They win 13-7. And then I think everyone at that point was like, common fan perspective, I completely expected them to beat Wisconsin in the conference championship game. Ohio State was kept out of the conference championship game because of the sanctions they were under. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, here we go. We are going to win the Big Ten. And not only did they lose to Wisconsin, they got destroyed by Wisconsin 70-31. Did, Sam and Brandon, did anybody see that coming?
Go ahead, Brandon.
We still made, the magazine was still weekly at that point. So we made game predictions. And I remember thinking Nebraska, that first Wisconsin-Nebraska game that season, I thought Nebraska had the better of it. And when I look back at that game now, I don't know why I had that impression. I predicted Nebraska to win by 3 touchdowns in Big Ten Big Ten championship game. So that'll tell you where I was at. I mean, there was some concern, I think, about player availability for that Big Ten championship game, but that Wisconsin team wasn't one that was that highly regarded. So yeah, for me personally, like I thought, here it is. It's kind of on a platter, Ohio State, because didn't they miss out on that? Because oh no, that was Urban Meyer. Never mind. Anyway, it was kind of on a platter there for them. You'd missed on the conference championship game twice. Here you ran the back half of the season gamut, and you had your chance, and was not to be even close.
Yeah. We were talking about when we go to the Rose Bowl, the World Herald was like, should we lease a plane so that we don't have to send people, commercial? We're going to go out 2 weeks and all this other stuff. I thought Nebraska would win the game for sure. When Taylor Martinez threw a pick six, though, on Nebraska's first possession, I was like, the game's over. Like,
really?
Yeah. Like, one of the most predictive elements of Nebraska games is when they give up points on a turnover like that, they don't usually do that well. But yeah, like Wisconsin scored so quickly on their first drive, and then Taylor threw a pick and it was 14-0. I know they made it 14-10 eventually, but it reminded me a lot of that 0-1 Colorado game. Like Nebraska was just not ready to play defense against Wisconsin that day, and I think Wisconsin ran for 639 or 650. I can't remember, 640 or some insane number. And I'll tell you, that was the turning point. There were a lot of people like Bo Pelini's, what do you want to call it? Approval rating was actually way higher than it was with the media. Like the media approval rating was what it was. And that started dipping in 2011, to be honest with you, or even 2010. But among fans, it was super high. That was the turning point. When they lost that game, my email inbox was more full than it ever has been, ever, before or since. And it was just dozens and dozens and dozens of emails. I think people were just like, what the hell was that? And they were right to feel that way. So that was the turning point. That game was to be clear, he did things early in his tenure that hurt his chances later on. But that was the game where the fan base the tide started to change. And you're like, okay, yep, people are getting a little tired of this. And they could have maybe changed it a little if they'd beaten Georgia. And they actually played really well that day, but, they fell short.
That kind of leads to what I was going to ask you too, Sam. Is just it's hard to say that he could be on the hot seat after being in the conference championship game, but it sounds like there was definitely at least a shift in the perception of Bo and his program. If I'm reading you correctly there.
I think there was, and I think Bo, I've heard, after the fact that Bo was angling to maybe get out of there, maybe get that Arkansas job that Bielema took. Bielema ended up leaving Wisconsin after that game, and Barry Alvarez took over in the Rose Bowl. But maybe that job would have been Bo's. I don't know. Like I don't know what would have happened. But there was a switch. I think you saw a shift in what fans were saying to me. It increasingly became like it was like 80-20, then it was 70-30, then it was 60-40, and then by the end of his tenure it was like 45-55. It was much more split. And that was sort of the change. I based on what I had received from fans, that was the turning point.
So you think that
I think hold on, Matteo. Didn't Barry Alvarez like more than once like parachute in to coach the Rose Bowl? Like didn't he do that like two or three times? I'll just take it from here, guys. Yeah, I'll just take it from here, guys.
Yeah, he did it after Bert left.
Sorry, Matt. Sorry.
So Sam, you think that 2012 Big Ten championship game, you think that's a bigger turning point, or going back a year or so to the move to the Big Ten? Which one would you think was more of a turning point for the Pelini era?
It was a turning point in the fan base's perception.
Okay.
I think if you're talking about the underlying dynamics of it, I think moving to the Big Ten was a big deal, and I think just kind of, like I said, dropping the crystal ball in 2010, like that was a really good team, and the Texas game was nerves. The Texas A&M game was a lot of dysfunction. Bo being mad that Taylor's talking to his dad in the locker. I mean, stuff that really was not that big of a deal. And then they blew the Big 12 title game. They should have won the game. And then and then just basically not even playing hard against Washington. So like there was things that year that were like everybody was exhausted. Remember, he got rid of a good chunk of his staff after the 2010 season. Watson was out. Gilmore, the professor, as I called him, was out. A few of the guys were out. So I think Corey Raymond left or somebody left. I can't remember how it all went down, but so they had to make some Marvin Sanders left. That's what it was. So there's just all kinds of stuff that had happened and ways in which they tried to fix it, but the fan base changed. Like my sense of what people were emailing me was like, okay, there were people that were starting to say, I'm out. Like, I'm tired of watching that. That was embarrassing. And then over the next 2 years, pretty much every big game they lost. And then they had the first tape in 2013. They lose to UCLA. I think UCLA scored, I don't know, many in a row. I don't know how many. 37? I don't know. And then the Monday or Tuesday of after the UCLA loss, Deadspin gets the first Bo Pelini tape from 2011. And that's when, things really started to get interesting. And some people rallied to his defense on that tape.
Yeah.
And to this day, and maybe Brandon knows, to this day, I don't know how the tape, I have an idea. I have a pretty good idea of how the tape got to Deadspin.
Who was it?
But I don't.
You want to tell us? You want to share? You want to share with the common fans?
I don't know for sure either. I distinctly remember because I had flown back into Lincoln for that UCLA game and watched that whole thing unfold. I was scheduled to fly out on Sunday, got to Yoma Airport, I think, as that thing dropped. And I was like, oh, do I need to cancel this flight and go back down to Lincoln, or because what's going to happen here? And I mean, in terms of turning points, it's an interesting one. What's always stood out today about me, I think, and I've written this a couple of different times, like when we look at why is Nebraska football what it has been over this 20 years or whatever, I frequently come back to it's an amazing place. It's great to be a part of Nebraska football. All of the good parts of it can get really heavy. The difference with Bo is we basically have, not intended to be, but it's part of the historical record, how heavy it was for him. Basically saying people have no idea how hard this is. And to be quite honest, I don't think he's wrong about that. I didn't really think he was wrong about it at the time. And I still don't now. That said, it's not the sort of thing you want out there from your head coach, and certainly not the I guess more colorful parts of what were on that tape about the fan base in particular.
Yeah, it was a weird, the thing with the fans was dumb. Like, Nebraska fans are really supportive. The stuff with the media, so I remember that obviously with Dirk and Tom being mentioned. I mean, I'm pro Dirk and pro Tom all the way. So I understand his frustration with Dirk. I to this day I don't really understand. I mean, Tom did great stuff writing about Bo and was also really solid. So I don't know what that was all about, but probably just what was on the top of his mind, because both of those reporters were, in the post-game press conference. But yeah, I don't know. That first tape was not good, but they didn't fire him. Pearlman probably could have, but he didn't. And at the end of the year, end of 2013, many of us, not me, but many of us thought he would be let go after the Iowa game.
Yeah.
But the conversations I had had earlier in the week with a number of people led me to believe that he might be retained. And, I think Eichorst let it be known that he was considering that. And I think there were people who were like, no, we're not doing that. We're going to keep this thing going. And I think after the 2014 season, Eichorst didn't ask or tell. He just fired him. And so there was a difference there. Yeah.
I want to come back to this, but speaking of Eichorst, so that's another piece of this. There's so many layers to this story, I feel like. So Osborne steps down in 2012, and Eichorst started as athletic director in October of 2012.
He took over officially January 1 of 2013. But yes, he came on the scene in October.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm going to read something. This is actually from 2017 after Eichorst was fired. Sean Callahan wrote this.
Okay.
You have to start here. When Sean Eichorst took the job as athletic director, he was already down 28-0 in the first quarter. He was hired by former Chancellor Harvey Pearlman without any involvement from Tom Osborne. And then skipping ahead a little bit, he says, to make matters worse, there was a perception that Osborne was pushed out the door by Pearlman and Eichorst. If you are going to succeed here, you need Osborne in your corner. Without him, your chances of long-term survival are 0 to none. Just briefly looking at sort of the Eichorst tenure within the Bo era. Reaction to that?
The day that Sean Eichorst was introduced, it was at the Brandon may remember this. It was at the film streams, essentially, or not film streams, the Rimpa Ross Film Theater, and they also have the Alumni Center in there, Van Brunt Visitor Center. And for a couple of years, they were doing the pressers over there, which I don't understand. But anyway, he's introduced over there, and T.O. didn't get up and say anything, but he kind of tries to walk out the back. And for people who go to the Ross a lot, which I've done over the years, there's the entrance where you would leave to go, you go in or leave to go to the movies. And he tried going out that way, and I went after him. And I kind of got him outside. We did a 3-minute interview, and the media pooled around him out on the sidewalk. I mean, it was a bad look, and it didn't look good at all. So it was clear that there was a rift there. Eichorst was a Big Ten guy. So one of the things that Eichorst needed to do, or felt like he needed to do when he got there, and people can agree or disagree, he felt like the Big Ten does things a certain way in the athletic departments, and Nebraska had not yet made that adjustment. And so he made that adjustment. And I don't think everybody loved that. I think that rubbed some people the wrong way. Record keeping, bookkeeping, rule making, things that he just feels like, hey, if you're going to be in the Big Ten, this is how you have to run your business. And Tom Osborne can maybe get away with it because he's a superstar legend in the sport, but I can't come in here and act like that. And he was probably right about that. So there was some rubbing the wrong way there. Communication wise, he was not a great communicator. The Nebraska athletic director needs to be a good one. And since then, they've had good ones. I mean, Bill Moose said things he probably shouldn't have said, but he was a good communicator. He was a public guy, and Eichorst wasn't. And Eichorst wasn't a coach's AD. He was a player's AD, if anything. And so he's the guy that got the laptop in and all these other extra things, but he wasn't a great coach's AD. So coaches are brilliant, talented people who are often sometimes kind of needy. They're kind of lonely, and they also need they need a sounding board. They need somebody they can complain to that isn't their staff. And so that was important. That was an important part of it, is that he needed to have somebody. He wasn't great at being that for his coaches. And so Bo, I just don't think Bo and him got along real well. And it did feel like Eichorst was more belonged to the Harvey Pearlman administration than he did to the Nebraska athletic department. And that was a problem.
Brandon, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well said. Sean Eichorst is someone who does well on standardized tests, I guess, would be the way I always the way I always interpreted him. And I mean, and to Sam's point, I think kind of the more buttoned up business side of things, my impression was always that he did well with that piece of it. Unfortunately, it's not the part of the job anybody cares about. And it's not the part of the job that can get you fired. after losing to Northern Illinois, but that's a different episode. So we'll leave that for them.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, back to TJ mentioned that, I don't think you could talk about Eichorst without talking about Harvey Pearlman. And with this whole series that we're doing, his name certainly keeps popping up. We jokingly refer to him as Chancellor Palpatine instead of Chancellor Pearlman, being the Star Wars fans that we are. But, looking back at all this, what was his motivation behind the Eichorst hire? I mean, he kind of went, it almost feels like he kind of went rogue. I mean, we just talked about how Tom Osborne really wasn't really involved in it, which, just seems like a total mortal sin around here. Do you think Pearlman should have talked to some of those guys who were already in the department and maybe promote from within, or maybe just give the guys that Tom Osborne wanted to hire, give them a shot? I know there was a couple guys that he had in mind for the job. What do you guys think about that, Sam, and then Brandon?
Well, yeah, I mean, Pearlman gets a lot of heat. I'll start with this. Harvey Pearlman doesn't really deserve much criticism for hiring Steve Peterson. That was a universally agreed upon hire, including Tom Osborne. So, Steve Peterson made mistakes in this role and certainly did some things he shouldn't have done. But that was not a out of left field hire. That was an expected and applauded hire. So then when he fired Peterson, he brought in Osborne. And, I don't know that I think Osborne potentially, and you could ask T.O. this, if he felt like he was pushed out the door, then that's unfortunate and wrong. I don't know that I would say that Pearlman was like, you need to leave. I don't think that happened. And then when they decided to hire an AD, I think they did a search. I think they weren't going to hire Trev. I mean, he'd been at UNO for about 4 minutes. And I think they wanted to go out and get somebody who understood the Big Ten and had experience in the league. And they went out and got, a sitting AD at the University of Miami who, if he came in and had Troy Dannon's personality, I'm not sure that guy's still not the AD. You know what I mean? I think it was a personality thing. I think the components of let's go get a guy that's pretty good with money and, can sign a better Adidas deal than Osborne did, which he did. And, can get this place, in shape a little bit for the Big Ten, because the Big Ten's got more rules maybe than the Big 8 or the Big 12. It was just the personality. The fit was not good. Sean had a sign. So you guys know what the energy bus is? You heard that book, John Gordon?
Yeah.
I know what it is from reading about Eichorst.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some things in the energy bus that I think are helpful. I think Rhonda Revelle over the years has used it. It's a perfectly fine book. But there's a phrase in there called energy vampires. And you can guess what that means. He had a sign on his door that I think said no energy vampires allow or something. And that's just what are you doing? And I think it was a picture he took with John Gordon. So maybe he just put it there once, but coaches by their nature are hard driving, in many cases, more empathetic than we realize, people who often, just have that moment where they need to come to you and they need to vent and they need to unload. And some of the coaches that Sean Eichorst had needed to do that. Tim Miles, a guy that everybody still likes, was he's a gabber. He likes to talk. He needed to be a guy that Tim Miles could talk to. And I just don't think Eichorst was really much of a talker in that way. And then Bo, I think Bo went back and forth. I think he taxed everybody. I don't know what Coach Osborne would say, but I'm sure Coach Osborne had moments where he was frustrated with Bo too. Come on now. So Bo could wear anybody out, and he told people that I can wear people out. But Eichorst just wasn't a fit. But I don't know what Pearlman was. I don't know that he was trying to do anything nefarious. He gets a lot of the blame. And what I'll say is there probably should have been a steadier hand, a firmer hand on the hiring process after Bo was let go. And there might not be a reporter who likes Mike Riley more than me. Like still text Mike. Like, he's a good guy and a good coach, but Mike, did, and you'll do this in a different podcast. He struggled here for reasons that were evident pretty quickly, and that it's very hard to go from Oregon State, a mom and pop shop, to a 5-star restaurant where you have 30 chefs trying to tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. And Riley was not ready for that. How Eichorst missed that is just unbelievable. Like, why would you hire somebody who had been at that small school, really out in the middle of nowhere with like 4 reporters, and bring him here with all the former players? I mean, the former Oregon State players didn't care about that. I mean, maybe they did, but you know what I mean? And he brought him here. And so, like, that was the area where Pearlman told me, we wrote a book about Scott Frost. I know we're going into different coaches, but and so I interviewed Pearlman. I got chapter 5 of the book, and chapter 5 of the book was all the screw ups. So I got the chapter I wrote is what your podcast series.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so I talked to Pearlman because I thought that was important for the thing. And a lot of it was off the record, but I said, Mike Riley, and Pearlman and his sort of drawl, and he's so deadpan. I had to Google his name. He had no idea who he was.
Wow.
That's not good.
No.
Dear Lord.
And if you got to Google the guy's name, you got to go back to your AD and go, Sean, I'm not sure you should hire
sure about this?
Whose name I had to Google. And again, I like Pearlman. I'm a little bit different than some of the other writers you might talk to. Like, he has been very helpful over the years, and he is actually pretty darn insightful. He's not a football coach or a football player, but he understands the dynamics of the NCAA. And he predicted to me several years ago, he's like, I don't know about Nebraska and NIL. I just don't know. The Nebraska fans are great, but some of these places got a lot of money, a lot more, and a lot bigger in alumni bases than Nebraska. And he mentioned Texas and a few others. And I think he might be right. Like, Nebraska is going to be better in a revenue sharing model than they probably are in an NIL model, because I don't think they can compete with Ohio State and Texas in that world. Which is why revenue sharing is good, because I think Nebraska can compete there. Yeah. But so there's things Pearlman was right about, but he should have had a harder hand on Eichorst. He should say, hey, no, you can't hire that. You got to go out and get a guy, because everybody's expecting you to go out and get a guy, not 500. So he had to go out and get a record, and a guy that had won a lot of football games. And he got a guy that had won a lot of football games, but a guy that lost a lot too. And it was a bad fit and a bad pick, as much as I like Mike.
Yeah.
So that was the area where I think Pearlman failed, is he wasn't paying close enough attention to what Sean was doing when he was hiring.
Yeah. Well, and I think for Husker fans, from a common fan perspective, we're looking back at the last 20 years here, and we're looking for who's the constant player through all this. And really, I think, you could say it's Pearlman. So then I think Husker fans have, and it's just our nature, like, okay, well, that's the guy that's to blame, because things haven't been going the way that we want them to over all these years. But, by all accounts from you and Mike Babcock, heard he's a good guy. He's a fellow York Duke with Mike Babcock. So, Brandon, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I would echo what Sam has said, and my interactions with Pearlman have been fewer, but in terms of the astuteness, I mean, he didn't do it single-handedly, but he got Nebraska into the Big Ten, and I think, if you ask him, like, that's a pretty good career achievement to have. Like, yeah, obviously you want to continue to have success and do that, but like, that's a pretty big accomplishment. And he's always been somewhat, in my few interactions with him, but also just like reading something, when someone like Sam or some of the other people on the beat get a great interview with him, like, he seems to shoot it pretty straight and have a grasp of, like, he's not surprised by what anyone's asking him, because he's probably thought about it before.
for sure.
Well, you said nothing nefarious in Pearlman's decision, Sam. So I'll just ask you point blank: did Eichorst get brought in to fire Pelini? Yes or no?
Well, if Eichorst was hired to do that, he didn't do it right away. I mean, he waited another year. Yep. I think so. Part of what I think is like, go in, Sean, make an evaluation. We need to make sure that we have the right guy here. Pearlman was already on the record about Bo having embarrassed the university in the 2010 A&M game. I think, it's a question of context. I do think that Bo Pelini would have probably kept winning 7, 8, 9 games. And then there probably would have been a 5 and 7 year, and it would have been a meltdown. But that might not have happened for a while. It might have been 2017 before it happened. And he probably would have won 8 or 9 in 2015. And he probably would have won 9 or 10 in 2016. And the 2017 team wasn't very good, wasn't very talented. And so that might have been the team that, finished him. Who knows? They could have carried it out for a while, but everybody always feels this sense of urgency to get things done. And so there's always this like, if we don't move now, if we're not a first mover, or we don't move when we know it's not going to be what we want it to be, we're going to regret it later on. And, I think that was inaccurate with Frank. They should have waited and given him an opportunity to figure it out. I'm not sure he would have, but I think he deserved that opportunity. With Callahan, in my opinion, they probably did it at the right time because Callahan's coaches were getting and Callahan himself was getting a lot of abuse and just a lot of negativity, and it wasn't going well, and the recruiting class had fallen apart. Maybe Bo deserved another year, but I'll tell you, at the time in 2014, I remember we were driving back from Iowa and they'd won, and we were talking about it, and then that Sunday rolled around. We all I just remember we came to the press box. We were like, yeah, this was probably coming. So if he was hired to do that, if he was, then he needed to have a better plan for who they were going to hire after the fact. And that not Paul Christ. And again, big fan of Riley as a person and a coach. I think it's just unfortunate that Mike, he didn't get enough time here, but I also think that was a rough fit. And then what Eichorst did, he very much forced Riley's hand with Banker. Banker was out.
Diaco.
Bob Diaco's in, and that was a miss. I mean, and I feel like I had some conversations with Diaco that no one else had. And I mean, probably the most interesting coach they've ever had, including Bo. But man, that was not. Bob Diaco and Mike Riley were not a fit.
So you saw the strain, and you saw the strain, Sam.
Oh boy. Well, and I had some office conversation or just off to the side, and I've rarely run across people and when I'm like, man, you are different. And he's a brilliant guy, to be clear.
Yeah.
He and I never even reported it. He and I had a long conversation about Manti Te'o one time and all the stuff that happened because he was the D coordinator of Notre Dame.
Right.
And, so he talked about that one time for 10 minutes to me. He talked about the trophy that he made and why he did it and all these other things. So like, he was just a unique person. And Eichorst basically forced that. Like, you should go hire this, not quite like that, but like, he clearly thought Diaco was an incredible teacher, and even if Diaco was that, it was not a good fit for Riley. So
right.
So those are some of the things that I feel like Eichorst didn't do very well, and he gave Tim Miles a cold shoulder, which makes no sense. Tim Miles is a really relational guy, and I just don't think Eichorst made the effort. So,
yeah,
wild.
All right, so to bring it back to the end of the Pelini era now. So Nebraska would go 8-4 in 2013. We talked about a couple of those games. They were up 21-3 in that UCLA game and ended up losing 41-21. They also had, I just remember thinking they felt like they should have been better that year. Like Michigan State came in with the #1 defense in the country, and we actually moved the ball on them, but turned the ball over a bunch of times, lost 41-28. Iowa's first win against Nebraska in the Big Ten era. Lost 38-17. Again, turned the ball over a ton of times. That Iowa loss in 2013 is when Pelini swung his hat and almost hit the official and had his famous quote, "If they want to fire me, go ahead." So we kind of talked about, they didn't fire him. And then the Huskers beat Georgia in the Gator Bowl to finish 9-4 that year. And then my recollection of by the time the 2014 season rolled around is things sort of felt like they had maybe stabilized a little bit. I mean, Pelini probably was being forced to, but he was clearly making an effort to improve his public image. He had the cat at the spring game that year, I'm pretty sure.
He did.
And the Huskers, and then the Huskers started 8-1 in 2014. They had that sort of hot, like angry win over Miami in Memorial Stadium, I was there. It was just absolutely glorious. And then, of course, we talked about the Melvin Gordon game where they get off to a 17-3 lead. It feels like we're on the periphery of the playoff conversation, and everything just completely falls apart in that game. And then, of course, in true Pelini fashion, his team rallies, and they come from behind to beat Iowa in a game they probably had no business winning in 2014. DeMornay, Pearson-L brought a punt back. He had another great punt return to set them up for a score. They win that Iowa game. They get to 9-3. As you said, Sam, it wasn't going to be enough. So Eichorst fired Pelini 2 days after the Iowa game. Couple of now infamous Eichorst quotes. Quote, "We weren't good enough in the games that mattered. I didn't see that changing at the end of the day." And then the other one that haunts us to this day, in the final analysis, I had to evaluate where Iowa was.
Yep.
End quote. So here's one question, Sam, that I'm curious about. What if he had the exact same record, but the losses were not meltdown blowout losses?
I think he probably would have kept his job a couple more years, possibly. By the way, that was a turning point in Iowa's program.
Yeah.
Iowa football got a hell of a lot better after that game. And
Yes.
I think part of it was because of that game.
Interesting.
70% winning percentage for Ferentz since that game. 55 before that. They should put that quote on the Kirk Ferentz statue, not on the front, like on the side.
For sure. The special teams changed. I talked to Coach Ferentz that summer because people kind of thought he was going to be fired. And what he relayed to me at that time, so this is 2015, the summer before they went undefeated in the regular season, is just like, well, I'd spent a lot of my time the last year or so, raising money for their new football building. And so he had all these things on his plate that he felt like he was finally able to get off his plate. And in doing that, I think he felt like they were able to, kind of turn a corner and figure out the quarterback situation, which they were able to do. So, but that was a turning point for Iowa. If some of the blowouts had been closer, that's entirely possible. That he would have kept his job. I think the Big Ten's current iteration, he probably would have been okay with it. The offenses in the Big Ten have gotten a lot worse. They're not as good as they were when Nebraska entered the league. There's various reasons for that. Maybe it's because COVID, the defenses got older. I do think there is something to be said that when you created this Western regional division full of teams that didn't have very much talent on offense, that Iowa and to some degree Wisconsin created this code to win games, and that you didn't really need to have an explosive offense to do that. And so that'll kind of change now, I think, because Iowa, if Iowa decides that Iowa wants to go, let's say 6-3 in the Big Ten, that's going to be good for like a tie for 5th or 6th. And they won't give you a trophy for that. So Iowa's going to have to figure out what it wants to be, as is Wisconsin, as is, Illinois. Is Brett Bielema really going to keep his job at Illinois if he finishes 7th or 8th every year? I don't know. If Matt Rule finishes 7th this year, and that means they went like 7-5 or 8-4, people will be thrilled. 5 years from now, he won't be able to, go 7-5 and 8-4 and have the same reaction. So, yeah, I think Bo might have kept his job a few more years.
Brandon,
hard to say.
Yeah, I think that's probably about the extent of what we'd be talking about if those losses were a little bit different. I think if you look at it, kind of, you extend that out a little bit. It's another Youngstown guy, Mark Stoops, but Mark Stoops is Kentucky, and I don't think that's ever like long term. I don't think just kind of that level of consistency plays at a place like Nebraska. It's the historical standard's too high. I think the fan base rightly holds the program to a higher standard. than that. And it's just kind of human nature at a certain point. It's nice to be very good, but you're always going to want to be great. And I don't know that Nebraska was on its way there by the time we reached the end of 2014.
Yep.
Amen.
I'm curious, guys. Do you think the Pelini era goes differently or ends up any differently if he didn't have to deal with moving to the Big Ten, deal with moving to a whole new conference? I mean, Sam, you kind of said it, and I've thought this all along. He had Big 12 offenses figured out, and that defense that he ran with overload 5 DBs and they had their peso back and all that stuff. Do you think things end differently with Bo if we don't move to the Big Ten?
Yeah, maybe. That's possible. I know a lot of people who miss the Big 12 still, and I understand that from every sport but football. Nebraska's in the right league for football. And some of the other sports, honestly, I think the Big 12 would be a better fit and is a better league, especially in baseball. But yeah, I mean, I think it's possible that things might have ended up a little differently. It's, I do think it was an adjustment. And the thing that Nebraska lost when they went to the Big Ten is any psychological advantage over anybody. Like, do you remember when Paul Rhodes lost his stuff when they beat him in 2009 and he's that thing?
So proud.
I don't think Pat Fitzgerald did that when Northwestern beat Nebraska in 2011.
No.
I don't recall. Maybe he did, but there wasn't the same psychological advantage. And so, when Purdue beat Nebraska in 2015, that was a horrible game, but I don't recall. I think Darrell Hazel was the coach. Yeah, he was the coach. I think, yeah. I don't
right. That's right.
Darrell Hazel being like, look at what we did in Nebraska. And it's just that wasn't there anymore.
And I think it was like Darrell Hazel's third Big Ten win ever or something.
It was embarrassing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they lost all of their gravitas. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And so, when they went into Wisconsin for that first game, it wasn't like Ohio State or Michigan going into Wisconsin. It was like this team that Wisconsin had never played before or hadn't played in a long time.
Yeah.
And so the intimidation factor wasn't there. And so Nebraska lost that thing when Nebraska would walk on a field with Kansas. Kansas might have the better team, but Kansas damn well knew that Nebraska had won, 94% of the previous however many games.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was that. Well, we always lose it, and that's always back there, right? It's always bad. Nebraska volleyball has that advantage now. They were able to carry it over to the Big Ten. They've established now that, if you play Nebraska volleyball in the Big Ten, you are going to lose unless your name is Wisconsin, and that's worth points. Yeah. Iowa's not going to beat Nebraska in volleyball. They could have the best team they've ever had, and the psychological advantage is just too big. So. Nebraska lost that. I don't know. Maybe he'd still be around.
Well, Rab, I swear this will probably be the last question. We're going deep here. We're doing the what ifs here, I guess, at the end. But just how different would you think the Pelini era would end? Say we just win one of those conference title games. Do you think that changes things drastically? If everything else stayed the same, but we just won one conference title game, does that era end or change drastically?
Brandon, do you think he would have left Nebraska if he had won one of those 3 title games and taken a job in the SEC?
I do. It depends a little bit on which one. And, for me, if you win that 2012 title in the Big Ten in your second year, it kind of resets the clock a little bit. Would have been a little bit, say you get 09 or 10 and everything unfolds pretty much the same. I think you're at a similar spot as in 2014. It just might be 2 years down the road. But that's kind of the other piece with this discussion overall. And then I'll let Sam speak on it. Is I don't know how long Bo was for Nebraska voluntarily if the choice hadn't been made for him.
Interesting.
Yeah. If he had a little bit more success early in his tenure, I do think he would have started looking at other jobs. The The Penn State job in 2012 was hired basically by committee. But they hired a personality that is within the range, the spectrum of Bo Pelini. I mean, Bill O'Brien is within that range. He might have just gone somewhere else. I just don't know that he was long for that job. Maybe 6, 7, 8 years. That's possible. He wasn't long at Youngstown State. I mean, has anyone ever watched the press conference he gave after they lost? I don't even know who they lost to.
Yes, when he almost blacked out.
Yeah, not the North Dakota State game in his first year, but like his last season there. And this reporter with this squeaky voice is like, "What do you think it is?" And he's like, if anybody saw that press conference, they're like, "This is a morose man." And he's kind of funny. He was like, "I just can't believe." And I'm like, "Dude, you're talking about Youngstown State against Southern Illinois." Like, he was still apoplectic. And so it was kind of like, this guy he has a hard time outrunning himself. And I have a lot of respect for Bo Pelini in a lot of areas. He's a brilliant coach. And I watched that guy coach special teams when they were horrible. Remember, their punt return unit was terrible. And that 2014 year when DPE got there, he coached it. And he coached every single position. And he knew what he was talking about. And they got a lot better because he was coaching it. So he can coach. But he was just sort of a kind of a dark soul.
Yeah.
A little bit. Kind of morose. So I don't know if he was going to be a head coach forever. I just don't know.
Interesting. Well, gentlemen, I guess that we'll go around and do it. I feel like we've analyzed it from just about every angle, but I think we've got to stick with what we do here and ask the question of the day, which is Bo-liever or Bo-liever. I want to give Brandon and Sam the final words. So, Matty O, why don't you start us off?
I'm kind of in the camp of, while we were doing this, I thought of it. We recorded a podcast several months ago and talked about all the crazy things we do with our behaviors and things during games. And I remember TJ, you saying that your wife said that you're just a little bit manic watching Husker games. And I have no doubt in my mind, you, me, many hundreds, thousands of Husker fans are that way, and got even more so that way during the Pelini era. I mean, just the roller coaster. We'd have a big win, and the next week we'd lose to Texas Tech at home when we're not supposed to, and it just kept going up and down. And I don't think we could have done it forever. And I like what Sam said. Maybe we have a couple of decent seasons, win 8 or 9 games in 2015, 2016, and I think it fizzles out. Or like Sam just said a few minutes ago, I think Bo leaves. So I was a Bo-liever and then turned into a Bo-liever. So I think it had run its course.
Geoff?
I'm gonna go the opposite direction. I always liked Bo. He was fun for me. I mean, even when we weren't playing well, at least I knew when the football game was over, there was still going to be more stuff to watch after the fact. The day was not done, even if the game was over. So I was a Bo-liever, and I still, it was probably the right decision, but I liked him. I wish he would have stayed. He was fun.
I have to imagine the Pelini era sort of didn't help your smoking habit at the time, Jeff. Yeah, it's funny because I remember being so torn when he was fired and thinking, here we go again. But I also remember thinking, like, what could the possibilities be? Like, here we go. It would be nice to get off the roller coaster. It'd be nice to like take things to the next level. And so I think, we've talked about it. Sam, you talked about it. I don't think you can have this conversation without looking at the fact that then they went and got Mike Riley, who, God bless Riley. And such a good man and a good coach. But Sam, I remember you're the one who made the point, I think, back even in that time, like the guy had no experience in the Big Ten. He was in his early 60s and you're asking him to do the best coaching job of his career. It really wasn't fair to him. Right. And so I think, at the time I was super torn. In retrospect, on Bo, that is, in retrospect, I think the string, as you guys have said, the string had kind of run out, and Bo had exhausted all of us, and maybe had exhausted himself as well. And so, again, with the caveat that you need to go money whip a proven winner, I'm going to say I'm a Bo please leave her. Brandon?
Yeah. After that Iowa game in 2014, I remember vaguely, but my column was essentially about, like, the question with Bo was never could he punch his way out of the corner. Like, that's kind of what he needed a lot of the time. And personally, I think from, loving college athletics for a long time and watching a lot of it, like, coaching is really about reducing the amount of variables, and the volatility was just too high. I think to like it seems strange to say about a guy who literally won very, very consistently 9 games at least every year, but I think kind of, the Pete Carroll term, win forever. It's about finding / building your advantages and then maximizing them. And it just always felt like a little bit too much of, well, maybe this is the advantage over here. And then you had the house of cards nature of it in those later Big Ten years where there was something psychological there where things could get rough in a hurry. It wasn't quite smooth enough, I think, for what you need for where the fan base wanted Nebraska to go from where Pelini had brought them.
Yeah. Sam, you get the final word.
I think Bo's been out of coaching since 2020, since 2021.
Yeah, some few years for sure.
Yeah, I hope he comes back and he's a coordinator again. I'm glad that he got the break. I think that Nebraska got him in a moment where he was probably at the peak of his powers in the first couple of years he was there, and then the power was starting to diminish a little bit, and it was getting to him. And so I think it was probably best for him and for the program that he left. But he made a lot of good memories while he was here. And there's a lot of things about him as a guy that was entertaining and it was polarizing, and you never quite knew what was going to happen. you just never knew, and you had stories. You could tell a couple of stories. And as somebody who watched, who covered the Frost era was just sort of like downbeat. Like Frost, I think actually had some of the same sort of personality traits as Bo, but he didn't have the charisma. And so everything was just sort of like, ooh, it was all heavy. And so, like, I now better appreciate some of the charismatic moments with Bo because I feel like Scott had a lot of the similar traits, but he didn't have that same level of positivity or like those ups, and his team didn't have him either. So I've come to appreciate Bo as potentially the best head coach that Nebraska's had since Frank, until what I think Matt Rule will eventually do.
Oh.
So I think he's the best head coach in the bunch, and that's hard to believe, but he had to go. Yeah, it was time for him to leave, and I think he knew it too.
Yeah. All right. Well, what a phenomenal discussion, guys. Thank you so much. Thanks to Brandon for joining us for all these episodes. Sam, thank you so much for making time to join us. I know you got a million things going on. So thanks to Sam McKewon of the Omaha World Herald. Make sure to stick with us, Common fans. This is episode 3 of the Reckoning series. Episode 4 will examine the question, was Mike Riley the biggest miss of the post-Osborne era? Again, big thank you to Brandon. Big thank you to Sam. Thanks so much to all the Common fans. As always, GBR for life.